Hey guys, I'm hopping on today to talk about how to communicate with end clients when you are working with an agency or I guess agency is probably the best way to put it. When you are working for an agency, maybe not obviously, but when you're working for an agency, hey Kate.
Hello.
Hello. I was just saying that when you're working with an agency, you really kind of have two clients. You have the agency itself, the people who are literally paying you, and then you have the agency's client who is also your client.
Yep.
And things can get a little complicated when it comes to communicating with that end client.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially depending on the agency, if they want you to communicate with the end client or if they don't. And a lot of times you're not going to be communicating with the end client necessarily unless it's in a more formal setting, I would say, of like a creative review or a kickoff or things like that, where you're part of the bigger team that's working on something, versus where you're kind of working one-on-one with a direct client. You might be the one setting up those meetings and the one kind of shooting those emails versus routing things through a project manager.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it can get, I'd say complicated, but I think when we're used to working with the end client, it's we're used to being able to shoot off an email with a question anytime we have one, or
Mhm.
if we're really close to a client, even shoot off a line to them and say, hey, I was thinking about this, how does this strike you? But you really don't have that opportunity in an agency setting. um, how do you think that affects, because I mean, yes, you can go back and forth to a project manager with questions again and again and again, but that's not really the best way to do it. Have this interim person repeatedly asking questions to the client. How do you see the best way to get what you need through that project manager?
Yeah, great question. Because I think you hit it on the head. If you're used to firing off those emails to your client and working really collaboratively and having someone who's very responsive, it can feel very frustrating to have that process slow down at all. So I think the first thing is digging in sooner rather than later. So not waiting until you're in the midst of writing to realize certain questions. I've got caught in that trap before where I'm like, oh yeah, this is easy, like whatever. And as soon as I start digging into the project, because inevitably when you start writing or outlining or whatever, you come up with new questions and you come up with new things, and that just doesn't happen until you start that process. So I start that process a little bit sooner sometimes. Say, okay, here's the project, here's roughly, I know we haven't had a kickoff, but let me start digging in and like outlining what I think this will be, and then come to the kickoff with even more questions than I would otherwise. And then really batching questions and kind of weighing what are the most important. I just had a client who the project manager had a meeting with the client, and the client wanted certain word choices. And I was like, hey, here's why I wouldn't recommend that line that they said. It was I think unintentionally demeaning to their audience. And so she said, got it, but like budget's tight and like, I'm not sure. And I said, got it. Like, this is a battle I think that's worth picking, in that I think you should do our due diligence and raise it to them. But if they're still adamant, then fine. Then, there's nothing grammatically wrong with it. It's not wrong. It's just not the best line. And so we had that discussion. So I think having those discussions and knowing like, I'm trying to think of an example where you wouldn't. I always use the customers versus clients when a client once wanted to swap that word, and it was like, okay, cool, like that. It's not worth talking that through. It's not worth having a conversation around that. Let's just, yep, cool, we'll make that change. So I think that's a big key, is knowing which changes you really need to work out with the client. And then even raising your hand and saying, hey, can I be in this meeting? Because sometimes people won't include you by default. They might just, the project manager might just want to kind of keep that project moving and not want it. The more people you introduce, as anyone knows, the more cooks in the kitchen. It's just very easy for a project to go off the rails.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and there's an element of not stepping on toes too,
Yes.
right? Like
Yes.
it might be tempting to, if the project manager is trying to explain something and they're kind of having trouble understanding how to explain it, might be really tempting to say, oh, well, just let me get on that call. But the creative director, whoever you are reporting to, might not be okay with you directly talking to the client.
Yep.
So you definitely need to make sure that you have your creative director's buy-in before you start interacting directly with that client, because they may say, whoa, that's not how we do things here. Or if the only person who directly interacts with the client after this point is me, the creative director, something like that. And you certainly don't want to get in trouble for stepping on toes, for going above anybody's head, for going around anybody or things like that. I definitely agree with that, with your point about like, hey, can I be in this meeting? Just make sure that you are asking the appropriate people, asking the people who,
Everyone.
and it's okay too to be asking a couple of people if they have, ask the project manager if it's their meeting, and ask your boss, the creative director, to make sure that you have both of their buy-in to be a part of that meeting. And don't be afraid to explain why you want to be a part of that meeting too. It's I want to be a part of this meeting because I want to have the chance to explain this, or I want to be a part of this meeting because I want to hear from the client's mouth what they have to say to this, that kind of thing.
Or alternatively, giving your project manager, if you're not going to be part of, hey, here's what I need you to say to the client to explain for me. And they're usually fine kind of taking that role. They're used to taking that role and saying, okay, I understand where you're coming from. Let me now work this out with the client on my end.
Yeah, and you may be doing the project manager a favor if you write them out a paragraph.
Yep.
And say, okay, these are my questions. Here's why they are important, blah, 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 blah. You feel free to take, copy and paste it if you want to, or rewrite it if you need to. But because, project managers are part of the process, but they're not the creative mind, and they are not they're not the client. They're just, they're in a different role, and they may not know how to word what you want them to say, or they may not know how to explain it or anything like that. So if you can do that for them, make it that much easier, then you don't necessarily have to be on a call. You don't necessarily have to, which actually that's another thing too, is that, now that so many calls are done over Zoom, so many calls are done over, it's worth asking if calls that you're not on are going to be recorded. Yeah. You can watch later, which I have to say is really nice, because that is not something that was ever really an option during the earlier parts of my career. You would just kind of hear afterwards what the client said, and you're kind of like, okay, but why did they say that? And the project manager goes, I don't know. But when you can actually watch the recording or listen to the recording, or even, listen in a call on mute, if that's a possibility. Some creative directors will be okay with that if you listen in on a call, but not necessarily participate in it. And again, it's not that there's a power level thing, but there is an authority element.
There's a little bit of, I don't want to call it chain of command, because command sounds like, authority. It's a very military term, but there is that the people have their own roles, and what you said before, you don't want to step on people's toes. And I think one of the other areas to be really careful that this happens, that I've seen happen, is with email, in that I've had clients email me directly and cut out everyone else from the group. And so I, noticing that, add them back in, add in the project manager, add in the designer if they're need to be on, add in all the people that were on an email that the client, maybe by mistake, maybe just they wanted to expedite something. Yeah. But alternatively, knowing on your end, because if you're used to just shooting off, like we said earlier, those emails directly to your client, knowing that you need to loop in, before you shoot off the email, see if you should be shooting off that email, or again, like you said, write out that paragraph and route it through the project manager. But if they say, yeah, go ahead, making sure they're all CC'd, all the appropriate parties are CC'd, so it doesn't feel like you're intentionally leaving something out, which is never, I think, anyone's intention. Everyone just kind of wants to expedite things. You want to move fast. You want the information you need to keep working. And so communicate that, though. If you have a timeline that you need to meet. Hey, I need this by this time on this date if we're going to move forward with this. Or if it's a piece of information, you can do the bulk of the project and leave kind of a placeholder of like, hey, we just need the client's input for this one section. And you can work then with the project manager to figure out, okay, do we want to pass this along to the client? Do we want to try to wait for them to weigh in? Because, you know, clients have a lot on their plates. And so they're not always on the ball as much as you want them to be.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about when a client will leave everybody but you off an email, which, yeah, they'll do because they want it done quickly and they know that you're the person who's writing it. You know, it doesn't hurt to go to your creative director and say, hey, I just got an email directly from XYZ client. Do you want me to put everyone back on the distribution list when I respond? Or do you want me to respond and just CC you? You know, how do you want me to handle that? And which is a really nice, first of all, it gets you out of problems in the future because you're dealing with it right now, as opposed to just shooting off an email and then your creative director being like, you've been having this whole conversation with the client that I knew nothing about. This is unacceptable, which is, yeah, it is unacceptable. It is reasonable, right? But also too, for you to come in and say, hey, you know, this is what's going on. Do you want me to CC you? It shows the appropriate amount of respect to your creative director, because they are the director of creative, so they should be aware of all of the conversations that are happening. And for the most part too, when you're working in an agency, you should not be taking feedback directly from a client, which is kind of funny because it's so different from when you're working directly with the client, which case you are taking feedback directly from a client. But when you're working with an agency, that feedback needs to come through a couple of different people. And quite frankly too, the feedback may come to your creative director, and your creative director may temper it a little bit. They may say, your creative director may say, yeah, they say they want this, here's what we're going to give to them instead, and then we're going to sell it through in a different way. And a creative director has that leverage and has that power to be able to do that you as a copywriter within the organization might not be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. When in doubt, ask, because, you know, when you're working directly with the client and you're kind of the sole owner of a project, that's a very different experience than when you are part of a team and there's buy-in from lots of different people, and lots of different people need to be aware. So taking that time to pause, really slow down before just, here it is. Okay, can I go direct? If you're working directly with a client and that's the relationship, yes, but in this scenario like this, or if there's, you know, any scenario where there's more than just you on the project, kind of taking that time to slow down and really think before firing off an email, because it's so easy to fire off an email.
And then come back later and be like, oh man, I should have done that.
And really, you know, in a case like this too, especially when you have an end client, consolidation is really helpful, because clients, again, it can be so hard to get them to get on the phone or respond to an email, or, you know, again, they're busy. This is one piece of many of the things they're working on. And so the more that you can say, here's what we need, bam, 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 bullet pointed out, very concise, you know, simple things, then the easier it is for them to respond to that, each bulleted thing, and in one task, as opposed to like 5 emails being then 5 different tasks, even if it's the same amount of questions.
Yeah. Well, and I was just thinking too that, you know, it might seem a little annoying to have more people on a distribution list or on an email in the two form. I don't know. I can't figure out the exact word for that.
The two line, yeah.
And the people you're sending to, it might seem annoying to have more people or to CC more people, but that can also end up helping you out in the future. You know, if a client comes back and they're like, well, we don't remember having this conversation, then it's not you as the copywriter being like, yeah, you emailed me. Then the creative director is also on that email chain, can be like, yeah, you did, it's in this email, and you know, I will say that's the nice thing about having, you know, we working as a freelancer, working directly with clients can be a great experience, but also working for a company, working for an agency or an internal agency can be a great experience too. Number one, because you have a lot you can learn from creative directors and from designers and from other people in all kinds of different capacities. But there is something to be said for having a boss or having someone above you to back you up, you know, to say, okay, I'm going to take, you know, we're going to do it this way, and I'm going to take the slack if anything goes wrong with this. Or, yep, I agree with you, I'm going to back you up on this. Or, nope, we're actually not going to do it this way, but here's why. And having those people on an email chain can help, that's what I'm looking for, can help avoid problems in the future.
Yeah, reduce the stress for you too.
Yes, exactly. It's nice sometimes to have somebody to back you up.